What is up, folks? Casual Dad here with another faction review. We're going to go ahead and fill in the gaps here, so I'm going to go ahead and go all the way to the left and go ahead and do one of my personal favorites, the Aeldari or Eldar faction. I'll try to cruise through this pretty quickly, but this is one that I have a lot to say about, so we'll see how we do. Going to go ahead and just run left to right, starting with the Warlords, and then we'll talk about some of the key bodyguards here. First up is Zephrblade himself, who is one of the starting Warlords. He's one you're probably going to see a lot. He is epic, so he just recently gained that secondary trait of where you can get to level 2 of Inspire, or Inspiring Presence, which is not bad, especially when paired with his ability, which is whenever any card is destroyed on either side, yours or an opponent's card, all of your cards, including those in your deck, gain +3 ranged attack. So cool thing about that makes him a really, really good starting Warlord, because when you're starting out, you're going to have a lot of lower level cards, and they're not going to do that much for you. So this is a way where you can have fewer lower level cards and get some benefit out of them, even if they're just dying all the time. There's an interesting there's kind of an interesting conversation to be had here, where he is good starting out. Early on, if you're just starting to get to 2k with your ladder decks, 2k trophies with an individual deck with your Aeldari faction, he's really, really good. As you get higher up and games get tougher and cards get more powerful, that +3 is going to matter less. But it's also important to note that he is the cheapest of the Eldar Warlords, so as your bodyguards get better, he goes up in value just because you can squeeze more power into the deck. And then also, if you have things like Ready or Inspiring Presence, those also have a better or a higher impact with that additional +3. And it's small with an individual card dying, but it adds up really quickly, especially if you're against a full deck and you're dealing a lot of damage. Now the flip side is it's really not very good against an opposing deck when they have like 4 cards, just 3 bodyguards and a Warlord. So that's something to watch out for. But I do kind of stand by Zephrblade as a pretty solid standby Warlord. He's not one of the top performing ones, but he's one that you're going to see a lot and you're going to have to be able to beat. Mostly because of how good those Eldari bodyguards we're going to look at are in the end there. And I talked about Inspiring Presence here, but also he has this Scout 3, so he does Ready, and so as you're playing a whole lot of ranged attack cards, he does have a significant benefit when he's played. Now he is also pretty squishy, so the way to beat a Zephrblade deck is to get to Zephrblade and then hit him before surviving bodyguards kill you, because he himself does hit pretty hard, especially with his combination of traits and his ability, but not that hard. He's not likely to finish out a deck or a game by himself. So yeah, there's your Zephrblade. And I said Aeldari, Eldar. Anybody who's been playing the game or familiar with Warhammer for a while back will call them Eldar just by reflex. The Aeldari thing is pretty new. I kind of like it just because it is a little bit fluffier, because Eldar is an older word that's been around for a long time. Aeldari is pretty unique. I know there was a cutthroat business reason for it with trademarks, but yeah, I kind of like it. Also, the whole Asuryani versus Drukhari thing. That's something I'm going to note real quick, is you do have several distinct factions within the Eldar. You've got your Craft Worlders, you've got your Dark Eldar or Drukhari. Sorry, the Craft Worlders are also Asuryani. And then you've got kind of your outcasts, although Lilith is a questionable outcast. And then you've also got your more Drukhari, who also bleed over into the Inari, so there's a little bit of everything here. Moving along. Next up is Urian Ratgarth. He's one of the best Eldar Warlords you're going to find. He is also epic. He's got that Medicae, so he heals bodyguards on drop, and he also himself just recently gained the regen trait. Now he's still epic, so he's only going to top at regen 2 and only gain back 8 hit points per turn, per player turn, excuse me. But that's not nothing, and he does end up with a significant amount of hit points, especially with his trait and also with that Medicae. And his trait is whenever any card is destroyed in either deck, just like Zephrblade, all your Eldari cards, including the ones in your deck, gain +7 wounds. So he's a guy that can be, he's a guy that can be challenging to beat, because as you're killing his bodyguards to get to other cards, the cards you're pulling are also getting tougher, and any ones on the table that you're having trouble killing are going to be getting tougher as well. So if he's got a cheap fear card that you're not focusing down, that can really just keep building up and just sort of stay there and be kind of a gum up the board. So he can be very challenging, especially because some of the best competitive decks are very aggressive and rely on just burning through an opponent quickly, where he and Glogothrox and Chaos are two of the warlords that can just kind of swamp you. They'll just sit there and not die. And then they don't do any kind of bonus damage, but usually his bodyguards already do pretty significant base damage, so it's not a deck without teeth. And I'm going to go ahead and backtrack a little bit and talk about some bodyguards for these two. But Ratgarth is one of the most powerful and most successful Eldar Warlords. You're going to see him a lot. It doesn't feel as bad to lose to him because they're pretty standard decks that have a lot of variety, which is kind of nice. There's no gimmick that's just going to flatten you like a Badruk or a Greyfax, but you probably will see a lot of these, and they are going to be pretty tough matchups, especially for something like Creed or Lilith, who rely on, again, being very punchy and aggressive, and if anything slows them down, like Akaran or Shields, they can really kind of struggle a bit and lose momentum, and Ratgarth is your guy there. A couple quick things. So Zephyrblade, you're probably going to run into some of the more powerful cards. The most common Zephyrblade cards you're going to see are, of course, going to be Morgan Ra, really aggressive ranged attack base, and he also has that attack on drop and barrage. So the combination of all of that, he really, really benefits from having ranged attack bonuses. So if you're just attacking like 9 extra damage on him, that can add up very quickly, and that's only if 3 cards have died in the entire game, and that just keeps ramping up. Of course, his base damage is really high, so even if he's played early, he's a threat, but if he's played late, he can really punch hard. Likewise for cards like your Crimson Hunter. This one's also a very common card to see in your Zephyrblade decks. Very cheap for the amount of punch you get. Also has the dual traits now for being legendary and can max them out at trait 4. This guy hits so hard. I think at high level he's close to, outshone by some Tau cards, but he's close to the single highest ranged attack in the game. And I think there's some Orc cards that do better too, but he's very hard hitting. Then also you're going to see this guy in a lot of your Zephyrblade decks. He's got the Psychic area attack, that Psychic Blast, Psionic Blast? Yeah, there we go. He's got that Psionic Blast, so he can clear shields and wounded cards, which is really helpful in a Zephyrblade deck, and also has a very respectable ranged attack himself, so very, very frightening card. And another one that's somewhat newer that you're still going to see is going to be your Sorrow of Amun-Roth. Ooh, so dramatic. And Eldar is my main army on the tabletop too, so I like to make fun of them, but also I do really, really enjoy the whole aesthetic, the whole design, everything about them. And this one is, again, newer. It's common, though, so it's leveling up pretty quickly. You're going to see them more and more since its release. And that barrage at that combination of cost and that really high base damage is fantastic, and it's really helped kind of make Zephyrblade compete a little bit better than he was for a little while there. So up in those upper tiers, Zephyrblade is better than he was. As for Ratgarth, you may see Morgan Ra in there still. You may also see just some Drukhari. A lot of poison. It's a nice complement to his ability because his cards are getting tougher, so if he can also have your cards just sort of bleed away health at the same time, it's a nice combo to do additional damage. This guy also has a lot of hit points. It's pretty hard to get rid of, but is vulnerable to that big game hunter, so that can be the weakness of this one. But you don't want to shoot it or punch it, so it's a really valuable card for that. You can also see just kind of a lot of Drukhari cards in here. Chances are you're going to see a Solitaire in your Ratgarth decks. You'll kind of see those pop up a lot just because it has so much damage. It can really help kind of tip the scale. Where the Ratgarth deck is tough, this also makes it somewhat aggressive. And usually, if you're playing against an AI, they're going to play him late. So if you are playing against a Ratgarth deck, expect this guy to be one of the last bodyguards left alive, and make sure you save something that can block it. Shield and Endless, something tough that can take a couple of hits from this, and ideally not kill it, because you don't want to take Death Blow with 100 damage there. That can really set you back. But one of the more common builds you'll see with Ratgarth is also going to be your Psychic, because Psychers in Eldar hit really, really hard, but tend to have low hit points. The ability combos really well, where you're getting kills, you're doing the offensive damage, while also giving some defensive kind of barriers to your casters. So a pure Psychic Ratgarth deck is quite common and very frightening. And of course you've got your really big heavy hitters. Ratgarth is one of the warlords that benefits from running the Incarn, because he's relatively cheap, likes melee, and the combination of his ability and regen and Endless makes something that's near impossible to get rid of. So that's definitely somewhere you'll see that. I'll keep talking about the Warlords. Those are some of kind of the key pieces. A lot of these cheaper cards, you're going to see just a ton. Get back to the Warlords in a second. I mentioned a Fear card that you're not focusing down, can just stick around in a Ratgarth deck, and the Howling Banshee is the one I was thinking of. 5 points, not very high health or attack stats, but has Fear, is common, so levels up very quickly, and if it's gaining 7 to 21 hit points per turn, it can take a long time to clear this unless you dedicate fire to it, and it's going to be just sort of plinking you back in return. So that's a pretty common card to see in Ratgarth decks, no matter what the build is. And then in Zephyrblade decks, especially if you're starting out, the Precision Shot, those attack on drop cards, especially the cheaper ones here, are really, really, really good. They start out with decent range stats, but that's low enough that they really benefit from the +3 that you're building up, and that does also apply to their Precision Shot damage. So the longer you can kind of hold a Precision Shot card in your deck with a Zephyrblade deck, the harder it's going to hit when you do end up playing it. So that's something to keep in mind there too. A couple other cards that are going to come up a lot are going to be your Shadowseer, because this one has shields. It's a Psyker with shields. So I mentioned that Eldar Psychers hit hard but don't have a whole lot of defense. This is the exception, where you're going to see a lot of Shadowseers popping up in Eldar decks of pretty much any Warlord, just because they add a lot of extra durability that you don't have otherwhere in the faction. And also have all 3 attack types, so they can still clear shields and clear ancient cards while soaking up a ton of fire. Everything else, Eldar have a relatively small card pool, but just about everything has a place somewhere with one of the Warlord decks, with very few exceptions. So I would definitely kind of check out the full pool and experiment a lot. Everything in here, especially based on level, can be very successful. We'll go ahead and jump back to the Warlords. So you're going to notice that there's actually a nice balance in Eldar between ranged and melee, and they're one of the factions that also has a dedicated Psychic Warlord. But in terms of ranged, we started with Zephyrblade. Next up is going to be your Ilik Nightspear, who is a Craft Worlder, an Asuryani, but also kind of crosses over into that sort of outcast, Corsair kind of side of the faction. Really good ranged attack, and that adds up. I have quite a few levels to go. But he's got a really good ranged attack, decent cost. Actually most of the basic Eldar Warlords are quite cheap. They're going to be under 30 for all the way up until we get to the very far end there. And then his ability is, if an enemy card takes 75% more of its base health as damage from ranged attacks during a turn, it is instead destroyed. Now that is a little bit hard to read, but the thing about it being, if you hit cards really hard, in a lot of ranged decks you'll just nail a card and then it's sitting there on like 5 health. This guy gets around that. So if you have almost lethal on a card, this guy will punch through that little extra, and is one of the few Warlords that can counter Akaran, because if you flat out kill a card and it comes back with its 5 health, this ability triggers and clears it. So if you're struggling with Akaran, or just struggling to push that little bit of extra range damage through, this guy is fantastic. In terms of how to build him, he benefits a lot from target acquired, because you want to do extra range damage to a card, and you can maybe get a little bit of extra damage out of that. Maybe kill it and then have your target acquired card shoot something off lane because that card in front of it was cleared. He also benefits from really, really high range damage cards, just because if you can kill something outright, awesome. If not, the harder you're hitting, the more often you're going to trigger his ability quickly. Because if you shoot a card, deal 50% of its health, then you just have another turn where you're just going to kill it kind of the normal way without triggering his ability. If you can put through just a little bit extra damage to trigger his ability and kill that card 1 turn sooner, that's where Ilik really, really shines. And he can be a very competitive Warlord, especially because he's got that ability, which also triggers on Warlords, and he's got Deadshot. So he's one of the few Warlords in the game who can have all of your bodyguards on the board shoot at the opposing Warlord. So he's particularly good in the meta right now, because he is able to focus down the enemy Warlord and give you a way to kind of push through those Bruiser Warlords without having to clear the bodyguards first. So he's particularly good against Akaran, because you don't have to clear a lane to go ahead and hit him multiple times. And he's really good against the beefier Warlords who don't have shields. He does still stand up pretty well against the Warlords who have shields, but that is something that can slow him down a bit, because he's not terribly durable himself, and anything that punches back reasonably well is going to kind of give him trouble. But anything that does not have shields, he's going to really shine against. which is funny. So he's still good against Akaran, but Akaran is still Akaran, so that's something that's good to remember. And by Akaran, I'm talking about the Space Marine Warlord, the starter Warlord who has the, every time it dies, every time a card in the deck dies, it comes back with 5 health. He has shield, so he's hard to clear, but that dead shot can really help give you a little bit of an edge to clear him. So, great one there. And I talked about that Crimson Hunter over here and that Sorrow. Those two are really, really good cards in your Ilik decks because they have the ready to do extra range damage, they hit really, really hard, and also that Barrage can help add just a little bit of extra damage to make sure that you are hitting cards for that full 75% as often as possible. So he really benefits from a pretty small deck that has really hard hitting cards in it. Next up, we're going to jump to one of my very favorites and probably the best Warlord in the entire faction. This is Lilith Hesperax. Comes in a little bit higher cost, but still not triggering the big Gem Hunter, so she's still relatively cheap compared to a lot of other Warlords. Hits very hard, only has the melee attack, so she's the only one of the ones we've seen, Ratgarth. So some of these Warlords really do suffer from only having a single attack type, which doesn't make them very flexible in the end game. And you hope you're up against an opposing Warlord that isn't as good or better in that attack type. So if she's up against an Avatar, that's a problem. But, and then she's also got the outflank, so she does start with a bit of a range attack bonus to your cards, and then also debuffs the opponent. But the real magic with her is her ability. When a friendly Aeldari card kills an opponent's card, return it to your hand up to a maximum of 2 times. So each card in your deck you can play 3 times. Initial deploy, and then twice more if it's getting kills. There are a couple ups and downs to that to remember. It is, I think, personally, quite a bit better than Creed, who's also one of the really good Warlords in the game, because you don't have to lose a card to trigger it. So the challenge is you don't have to lose a card to trigger it, but you do have to get a kill. So she's still slowed down by shields and by Akaran in a way that some of the other Warlords aren't, but still is tremendously powerful because you just keep getting to move your cards around and choose your targets well, and that's really, really good. But one thing to remember is she is particularly good with cards that attack on drop, so your precision shots, your furious charges, which she now has, which is awesome. But something to note is that if you do get a kill on that, the card redeploys to your hand immediately, which is good, but it also does open up your cards that are left on the board to be hit back. So, especially against a Badruk or a Snickrot, you can actually kind of set yourself up for a pretty nasty failure if your cards are deploying back to your hand, and so they're not there to soak some fire. So if you have an injured card left on the board, that can get some of them killed. So she's really, really powerful, but does definitely benefit with some careful play. I mentioned that Shielded Psyker. That's a very, very popular card to put in a Lilith deck, because when you redeploy a card, it triggers its abilities again, including shields. So if it was a taunt card, it gets taunt again. If it was a shielded card, it gets full shields back. If it attacks on drop, it'll attack again. So some very common cards you'll see in there, in addition to that shielded one for defense, is you'll see Morgan Ra, and he'll just keep shooting. So he is dropped on the table, shoots, kills something, goes back to your hand, done again. Does incredible amounts of damage over the course of the game. And one of the things that's really held Lilith back over the last couple seasons is that lack of barrage. So again, shields and Akaran could slow her down, so every card that gained barrage is a huge boon to her, and especially being one of already the most popular pieces in her decks, but also now gaining that additional trait that'll be very valuable. Now it's only at level 9, so it's kind of hard to get there, but once you get there, that is a really good piece. But so kind of the typical Lilith deck that performs really well is called the Flying Circus, and that's a mix of melee, ranged, and psychic. So you've got Morgan Ra, you've got your Solitaire in there, you've got your shield card in there, and then whatever kind of other punchy heavy hitters you want to do ready or outflank or taunt. This one is Furious Charge, which comes up a lot and is very powerful. She actually comes up a lot because she's got that Death Blow, still a really powerful card and a nice kind of cheap one to slot in there to fill things out. For me, I've found that varied damage type is actually less effective now because of how the meta is shifted. A lot of the matchups I'm seeing really do they can weather that Flying Circus effect that you have in the classic Lilith deck. So I'm finding she's performing significantly better if you focus on one damage type. At the moment I'm hitting ranged really hard, where I've got both my Emon Sorrow and my Crimson Hunter in there, and then a couple heavier hitting ranged cards. That's really, really been helpful. because if you mix in that melee and ranged, all of your cards aren't attacking all at the same time, and you can kind of suffer from not doing enough damage quickly enough, even with your redeploys and attacks on drops. I also had a very small, really, really hard-hitting melee deck that centered around the Incarn. That worked really well in one season. So last season I did heavy range, season before I did heavy melee. Both performed well. So if you're running Lilith, I would play the Flying Circus with that varied deck, but also experiment a bit with those mono decks that do all melee, all ranged, maybe even all psychic, just to try them. I don't recommend the all psychic. I don't think that combos well with her ability, but I had to say it. That is another note I wanted to bring up, is that I did mention the Hemlock Wraithfighter as something with that Psionic Blast, and also has a good ranged attack. My Zephyr Blade deck right now is using both Carhadron and the Wraithseer, because they both have Psionic Blast, they both have really good hit points, and they both have really good ranged attacks, so they benefit from his ability, but they also have multiple attack types, and that area effect Psychic Blast really makes a big difference in being able to clear injured cards and clear those shields. But I also like it because you have an offensive option that is neither ranged or melee, which is really valuable against decks that can outshoot you, especially at first, or really heavy melee ones that are punching you back really hard. And is a nice defensive move against Psychic decks, where if they're hitting you with Psychic, you are also doing some damage back. So I've been really... That's one of my more successful Zephyr Blade combos, is now that I've got the cards at a high enough level, they're not kind of a waste, because those two are so expensive that they really need to pull their weight. Otherwise the deck is just not going to be able to make it. But that's something that I've been playing with that makes my Zephyr Blade a lot more competitive at the upper levels, where he was kind of struggling with the more classic all-ranged decks. Zooming right along, I'm very proud. I got really lucky with card drops, and I've got Eldrad, the man himself, up to level 9 with his maximum Brotherhood of Psychers. Obviously someone that you want to use in Psychers with, because he's tremendously valuable. He is legendary, so he can get his traits up to level 4, and he's got both that Inspiring Presence for the flat base damage bonus, and then also that Brotherhood of Psychers, so if you have other Psychic Bodyguards on the board, he gets a significant damage increase for each one that's on the board. I think 40 each, yeah. So if you have 2 other Psychers on the board, that's almost double damage for this guy, plus 80. Especially if he has Inspiring Presence. So right now, that's plus 20, 2 other Psychers plus 80, so he's just literally doing double damage for me, which is fantastic. Especially with a base stat of 95, and his ability. This one's a little bit weird. So for each Psychic attack made by an Eldari card, each turn, increase subsequent Psychic attacks by 30%, and can be triggered by a card only once per turn. Now that last part is important because if you've got a card that has that Psionic Blast, where it's doing Psychic to the entire board, that counts. But it counts once. So if that card does Psionic Blast, that gives all of your following cards at plus 30%. But then if that card attacks later that turn, it doesn't provide an additional 30%. And likewise... Where are you, buddy? This guy right... No... Yes. This guy right here has the attack on Drop Psychic. That also will give you that 30% buff for that turn. So this is a guy you want in your Eldred deck, and you want to play him on your turn, because he applies that buff, and then he can attack immediately, or she, excuse me, can attack immediately and get the get that 30% bonus. So your really devastating turn is going to be you drop that 10.1 that gives you the attack on drop, that's plus 30%, and then you have one of these guys on the board for their Psionic Blast, that's another plus 30%. So you're already starting with a 60% bonus psychic damage before you even take your attack. And your final hitting card in the deck should be hitting with that full 90%, basically double psychic damage, which really can do tremendous amounts of psychic damage, especially with cards that already hit fairly hard, or with cards that don't. So in an Eldrad deck that's all Psychers, even your Psychers that have a fairly middling psychic attack suddenly do significantly more damage, especially if you have that Inspiring Presence from Eldrad himself, or Yvraine. Which is very thematic, because Eldrad and Yvraine are kind of doing their thing across the galaxy right now with the Inari. He's a little bit of a weird one, where he ends up being very, very glassy. He himself is relatively durable, but most Eldar Psychers are not terribly durable. So he does kind of struggle with where he can be held back a little bit in fights and can quickly die. But if you're able to burn down the opponent's deck quickly, you can see this guy just rocket through opposing decks. And if all your cards are very high level, you can probably weather some of those hits and get through and be very successful with Eldrad. He's one I want to try laddering and see where I can peak and see if I can get him to compete with my other decks. Doesn't usually perform as well as the others, both because of lower level, but also just because of some of the matchups you get are particularly unfriendly. Of course, if you run up against an Ahriman deck, then you're psychicking each other back and forth, and it's just like two glass bottles banging on each other until one of them breaks. Which, yeah, can be a good time, but also can be a tough matchup. Likewise, he can be taken down quickly by a melee or shooting deck. Those can be very challenging. But very heavy hitter, and he's got good hit points, and the addition of that Inspiring Presence does give him that little extra edge to where he can hang better now in the current meta with some of those Bruiser Warlords that you have to burn down quickly. He can do enough damage to break through shields and kill shielded cards quickly without having to take the shields down first, and he can even, I want to say he two-shots your Logan decks. So if you can tank one hit from Logan, then he should be able to finish him off. Maybe two, depending on whose turn you all end up deploying on. Let's see here, make sure I'm not missing anything on Eldred himself. No, okay. And I may come back to that, but that's where I'm going with Eldred. Last up, I did want to mention this. He does trigger Big Game Hunter, so you want to be careful with that and block those lanes of that Big Game Hunter because that'll burn him down real quick. He's got decent hit points, but not that good if you're taking that extra damage from that Big Game Hunter. So careful with that. Speaking of, the Avatar also triggers Big Game Hunter, reigning in at 73 points, which I believe is the single most expensive Warlord in the game. This is a real heavy hitter, very expensive. Always had that Inspiring Presence, and amazing stats, clocking in at nearly 400 hit points with a base damage of 128 before Inspiring Presence, and then also now has gained that Furious Charge, which has really helped him kind of stack up, because he's able to clear that injured Warlord, or injured Bodyguard, and then potentially clear out another one on your turn, takes out the card in front, and then hits the card that's remaining in either the left or the right, which makes his entrance much, much better. And because at that cost you're going to have a small or fairly fragile deck, you really want him to make an impression when he lands. But his ability is particularly nice. When any card is destroyed, one of your currently deployed Eldari cards gets plus 15 melee attack. And I really want to highlight the difference there because its plus 15 is much more than you saw from the other cards, with the other Warlords, Zephyrblade and Ratgarth. But it doesn't apply to cards that aren't on the board in that moment. So it's only going to apply to your cards that are currently on board and alive. So if you're killing something with Deathblow, your card could gain the plus 15 and then die. So you want to watch out for that. It's also important to note that that's random. It's not all of your cards, it's only one of them. So it is a lot and stacks up real quick, but that randomness can bite you in the butt. So decks with the Avatar are going to be fairly small, and you want a combination of your durable heavy hitters, but then also some of your squishier cards to die, but also to fill the deck to take some heat off of your other cards, but then also to just sort of be there to block lanes. Some very popular ones are going to be, of course, the Howling Banshee again, has that fear, comes in at 5 points, has a good melee attack, so is not a total waste if this one happens to get your plus 15 melee attack from a kill, but really is just for a cheap filler and blocking lanes. Likewise, the Carrion Call, the Razorwing Flock, is a really, really good card in the Avatar deck, is it can soak a hit or two, and then will give up the melee buff, and then die fairly quickly. So it's unlikely to get the 15. It's unlikely to get buffed by the Avatar's ability before it dies, which is kind of nice. Your ablative cards you want to actually ablate instead of taking that bonus. Some other common ones you'll see are going to be, of course, your cheap fear cards. So Moore is excellent in an Avatar deck because he's cheap, decent hit points for that level of fear, clocks in at a really good melee attack, and then also, again, has fear. So this is one that can really hold up a lane and do significant damage there. But probably your best cards in an Avatar deck, your kind of linchpin, sort of key main cards, are going to be the Howling Banshee, Phoenix Lord herself, Jane Czar. Lots of hit points, bunch of fear, Furious Charge, really high base melee. She is a great staple for your melee-based Avatar deck, and it's probably the deck she does best in, although she's also quite good in a Ratgarth deck for the same reasons. Already has a really high melee, has that fear, and a good bit of hit points that's only helped by gaining hit points from enemy cards dying, or any card dying. Really, really good, and I've had her regularly swinging for like 140 damage after surviving for a few rounds on the board in an Avatar deck. Another kind of staple is going to be your Solitaire again, just because, again, good hit points for the cost, really high melee attack, also has Furious Charge, and has that Death Blow. So as he's gaining stacks of the Avatar's ability, it also makes his Death Blow more valuable, and if you position him in a spot where he's going to explode exactly where you want him to, he does a lot of damage. Those are probably the two auto-includes. If you're going with the... I shouldn't say auto-include, I don't like that term. But if you're going for an Avatar deck, I definitely would reach for those two first, and then kind of build around it. Yvraine is also good because she has that Inspiring Presence, but she has kind of an awkward combination of stats and health, where she's fairly expensive for the hit points she gets, and her hitting power isn't that great. I find she's a little awkward to build around in a Avatar deck because of the very minimal amount of points you have. But if you've got her high level, she's not a bad choice in there, just there may be some other options. Another common one we'll see is going to be Prince Uriel, in large part because his stats end up a little bit higher, both more hit points, heavier on the melee, doesn't have the Psychic, but he does have that Inspiring Presence. He's also legendary, so he's got the dual traits. So you get the defensive debuff of the opponent plus the buff on your attacks. You're going to see him a fair amount in your Avatar decks, and also some other decks too, but I see him the most in Avatar decks. Excuse me, Avatar and Ratgarth decks. He's very common in those too. Let's kind of look at some other options here. In my Avatar deck right now, I've got this guy at a high enough level where he's really, really good. Good combination of hit points and hitting power, and that Big Game Hunter is incredibly valuable in the meta right now because there are a lot of kind of bigger cards swinging around that you need that extra punch to take down. And I've already lined out several Warlords who are vulnerable to it, so it's a nice kind of bonus to have there. And then, of course, Furious Charge cards benefit a lot. She's one that has been in a lot of my Avatar decks. Isn't right now because she's not very durable, but sometimes that's a feature, not a bug, depending on how you go. And likewise, this guy also has Furious Charge, also a pretty solid piece to add in there at 6 points. He's going to do a fair amount of damage and then die. So he's not a bad one to include in a deck where you kind of want some of your cards to die and have a couple points to play with, especially since he has a very respectable melee hit for 6 points. And that about does it for your Eldar faction guide. Let me check here. Looking to see some of the other significant cards to make sure to include. One I do want to mention is if you're up against an Eldar deck, there's a good chance you're going to see this guy no matter what it is, just because his Psychic stat is really, really significant. As long as the deck has a couple Psychers in it, it'll benefit from having him in it. But even if you don't get the benefit of that Brotherhood of Psychers, he's still a solid piece to have. Especially in one of the more durable decks, like a Ratgarth deck with a couple Psychers. And of course in an Eldrad deck, he just is an absurd power puncher piece. You do not want this guy to hit you in a Eldrad deck. Even played by an AI, they still land real hard. And then just kind of zooming through the list real quick to see if I'm missing anyone. Eldar are kind of an interesting faction. They don't have very much Taunt, Regen, or Medicae. They've got one Medicae card. It's this guy right here. Pretty solid piece to use because he's got decent points. It's on the expensive side for a Medicae, so I kind of go back and forth on whether to include him in decks because his attack stats are okay. They're not terrific, and his hit points aren't terrific either. But he was a staple of my Lilith decks for a long time, especially the melee-rated ones, and because you can redeploy him and get Medicae multiple times, he can certainly be something to reach for, and I do see him a lot. He also does have both a melee and a ranged stat, so he can do well in a Avatar deck to keep your other heavy hitters alive, and can do well in a Zephyrblade deck, because he does have a relatively low ranged attack, but it's there and will benefit from Zephyrblades ability. I mentioned Taunt. We've already looked at the 3-point Taunt at the top. The other one is this one, who's just a weird piece. I really love the Vizark as a character. I was super pumped when they added him as a card. He's got a very sturdy combination of melee attack and hit points. He's also one to kind of consider experimenting with in your Lilith decks, because he's got enough attack power to take out cards, soak some damage, and then be redeployed to your hand, and then you play him again with Taunt for multiple turns. So he can be a really good utility defensive piece. And also he's worth considering in a Ratgarth deck, because if you don't play him early, he's going to build up some extra hit points before you play him with that Taunt. So he's definitely a card you don't see very often, but I think he could be very powerful. I think there's some unused potential there. One of the defining sort of things about Eldar on the table and in the lore is going to be their Phoenix Lords. We've got 4 Phoenix Lords here. We looked at Jain Zar already. and of course Mogan Ra. Those are the two you're going to see the most because they kind of define your melee and ranged attack. Just your sort of melee and ranged attack sort of archetype for the Eldar. They all, let's see, 35, 37, I knew it. So they're all close to the same price point, but Baharoth is the newest and the only legendary, so he can get very decent stats and has 2 max level traits. Also has really good hit points and has that Furious Charge. He's definitely one to consider. He's particularly good in a Lilith deck because both of those abilities are very good to have triggered on the drop. Good one to keep in mind. And he's got a decent combination of both melee and range, so he slots into pretty much any deck if you have the 35 points to play with. And it doesn't quite work to have either Janezar or Mogan Ra. Karandras is almost certainly the weakest of them. Got the secondary traits, has decent stats, but he's the most expensive and kind of the least inspiring. You'll see him sometimes, just because he's the father of scorpions. Of course, he's a big deal. But not very much, and I tend not to reach for him because there's almost certainly a better option at that price point. My personal favorite card in the entire faction is, of course, the Wraithseer. An amazing piece. Super, super expensive, but worth every penny, especially with the addition of regen. It's, again, only rank 2, so you're not gaining back a ton of hit points, but already starting with a lot of hit points already and being a very sturdy card in a faction where most decks will give you kind of passive buffs to hit points or damage. Really, really great piece. Definitely dominates in the shooting, but has good attack stats across the board, and that stat line is fantastic. To have that many hit points and that much damage in every single attack type, plus that Psionic Blast, amazing card. If you're struggling a little bit with pretty much anything, but you want to make an Eldar Warlord work, I do recommend experimenting with this guy a bit, just because he can really help kind of punch through stuff that's a little bit more challenging. Just incredibly powerful card. I think that's all the ones I'm going to focus on. There's more to talk about, but it is kind of a funny faction, so the other shielded cards, we talked about the Shadow Seer, the other one is this guy. Also decent in an Avatar deck as a defensive piece, and if the randomness swings your way, with shields, he's on the board for a long time, and so if you're killing other cards in other lanes, he can end up with a very respectable melee attack as well. So it's a good piece for the points and the defensive option, great in your Avatar deck. Eldar do have a little bit of poison. It's going to be in this guy here as both ranged and melee, and then this one here that's just melee for just a hair cheaper. I put them in a lot of decks, but I do end up using this guy a lot more often, just because you have more options to apply that poison rather than just melee, because there are a lot of things you just don't want to punch. And he can do this on defense. So you put him down, the enemy shoots, you poison them. They do melee, you poison them. Still very good. So it is a little bit of poison, and the other poison card is, of course, this guy that we already looked at, too. So decent amount of poison because you have that mix of your Asuryani and Drukhari cards. Good bit of barrage. We already looked at Mogan Ra, your Sorrow of Amonrath, excuse me. The other most common barrage piece is going to be your Dark Reaper here. Very, very cheap, especially for barrage. Really good in a Zephyr Blade deck to kind of play when you need to clear the board. Cheap piece that's going to die, but will probably shine brightly first. And then there's another kind of mid-range piece I'm kind of tinkering with, is your Harlequin Boat. This one's definitely at a higher price point, but also comes in with a really gnarly ranged attack for that price point and decent hit points. That's a great one to include if you have a high level, especially if you're struggling with shields and or dealing with Akaran. This can be a really great piece to kind of clear that for you. Yeah, I don't want to cover all of the cards. There aren't that many, so I kind of could, but we'll leave it there. That's it for now. I hope you appreciated this faction guide, and I should be clearing out the last couple in the next couple weeks. Thank you very much. Have a good time.